Good morning, good morning. This lady just asked me, how do I pronounce your name? That's always a little bit tricky. You know, I'm Dutch. That's not an easy name to pronounce, so well done. Yeah, the early bird catches the worm, right? So yeah, a little bit about me. My name is Rense. I reside in Amsterdam, and for Trend, I lead the global incident response, red teams, and parts of the CTI functions. That means that we, as a team, we see a lot of APT activity, both in terms of forensics as well as the CTI that we deliver to governments and enterprises, and we see them everywhere. Our company has a global presence, particularly big in terms of CTI in the APAC region, so we have a lot of insights into this. And today we're going to talk about red teaming, what we see in terms of the services around red teaming and what we think can change in this landscape if we look at this hybrid warfare and these blurring lines of attacks. So the origins of red teaming, as a lot of people here in cyber probably know, doesn't have its origins in IT or ICT or security at all, right? The origins of red teaming, they come from the military background. So mainly during the Second World War, where the Allied forces and later the NATO countries do simulation, battlefield simulations, and the opposing team, the opposing force, those exercises were called red teaming, right? However, if we look at the current state of affairs, in terms of cyber operations, and specifically cyber operations, offensive cyber operations of our, I would say, enemies, then that line is very much blurring, right? These conflicts are increasingly hybrid, where these cyber attacks are really blended with disinformation, coercion, and even physical operations. And we as a company, we track APTs, and we also see some of these things converging. So we really see that exploitation of these actors to further their objectives, but they're not just in the cyber domain. We see these units blending and actively working together to reach their objectives. And it's really difficult for us sometimes to really have strong attribution to that. And yeah, what states warfare, right? What constitutes that red line in terms of sabotage, disinformation, digital espionage, and where do you draw the line? And that is even for cybersecurity companies that do a lot of forensics research, that's difficult. So if we look at red teaming itself, that needs to evolve as well, right? That really needs to evolve with this ever-changing domain where cyber is really a battlefield. It is part of doctrine now. It's not just a factor. So enterprises, when they do red teaming, they really look at these quick wins, checking out vulnerabilities. Can we own this domain, and how fast can we do it? But if we look at red teaming itself in this digital domain where it is becoming part of warfare, then we need to have a different approach when doing these exercises. So if we look at some of these state-sponsored cyber operations, and these are a couple of very well-known ones, then it's really astonishing what we are up against. So because I am on, let's say, both sides of these services, so the red teaming, offensive part, pen testing, as well as forensics, it's astonishing the amount of attacks and breaches that we see in this domain, and particularly these three. And just, you know, the sheer volume of it is staggering. We have APT 41, for instance, listed here, and just, you know, the sheer volume of this, if we relate that to the amount of people that they may have or potentially have in cyber operations or offensive cyber operations, is pretty big. Estimates range somewhere between 150,000 to 600,000 people in MSS itself. So the amount of people in cyber operations, offensive cyber operations, is a large amount. And therefore, if we look at the type of breaches and we look at the type of organizations being targeted and we look at the volume of it, this is every day, everywhere. So especially, I would say, MSS at this moment, when it comes to digital espionage, they are incredibly noisy and very aggressive. Obviously, the Russian threat, if we look at interference, if we look at undermining NATO, if we look at undermining military capabilities, then this is really blending into their larger military objectives, and they are pretty effective in that sense. So it's a threat to be reckoned with. The Lazarus Group, we usually group a lot of these DPRK actors under the Lazarus Group, but there are, of course, different subgroups. They have been increasingly, I would say, sophisticated. This used to be a little bit the runt of the litter, so to speak, in terms of their capabilities, but we see that really ramping up. And where you have really a distinction between the B team, them being the crypto boys, right? They go in, they want to exfiltrate your wallets or your crypto information, or it's financial gains, banking, finance. You also have a team, and we see quite a lot of cases where they are actively after breaching defense-type organizations and exfiltrating information. So if we look at what their strategic objectives are, right? These are espionage, disruption, influence, and all to gain this strategic advantage. If we group these threat actors, especially the GRU-related ones, very much about that informational field, sowing discourse, and exfiltrating military or defense-related information. Similar China MSS-related operations after high-tech, defense, healthcare, biotech, they're everywhere. And there's only a few countries exempt from this. So if we look at the global field and we look at the cases that we process and we track these APTs specifically, we really see them active everywhere. And even doing attribution, like what are the subgroups, that becomes sometimes difficult because you have overlapping TTPs, but the sheer volume of what they're after and the amount of exfiltration is really staggering. So we're talking about massive amounts of data every day. And sometimes we are even wondering, yeah, they're in here and they'll keep trying to get in here, but what are they doing with all this information? The sheer amount itself, how do they process that? But it's concerning. And it's concerning because it doesn't just concern governments or military organizations. This touches a lot on enterprises or organizations that relate or are suppliers to military or to governments. And it's especially there where some of these defenses we think could definitely improve. So when we look at this threat, it's increasingly a hybrid field, right? Where we see some of these state-sponsored, let's say, objectives and classical means of intelligence gathering blend into cyber. And it's logical because, conventional, we had land, sea, air, and now cyberspace that's really becoming an integral part of that doctrine. And especially cyber because the attribution factor is hard, and that blurring line is very hard, and the sheer volume is very hard to track. They try to further their operations in this way. So they're actually more and more blending human operations with cyber operations. And we see that, right? We see, for instance, especially MSS-related operations, that we see people traveling to PRC, laptop is clean, they pop up in some hotel with a gift, right? And the gift being MSS malware, C2, related malware. So somewhere along the way, whether that is in a hotel or possibly at the airport, and sometimes if we look at telemetry, it's obvious it was either a USB stick, but sometimes we don't see that. So do they actually open up a laptop? How do they insert the malware? We don't know, right? But we do know that once it comes online, it has the gift. So that's really tracking your, let's say, target, knowing where they go, and then intermediately either intercepting their laptop or whatever devices they have with them and implanting the malware and or exfiltrating information. So those hybrid operations are becoming pretty tailored. I would say it's mainly Russian GRU, SVR, and China MSS related, but they are pretty aggressive in these things, and we see that more and more. So it's definitely something that we need to have a good eye on. OSINT reconnaissance, it's staggering what some people put out there, right? Really, if we look at some of these enterprises that, if you look at, for instance, hiring for IT personnel or security personnel, all of these job ads are out there, right? And it neatly lists all the expertise that they want, including all the products that you need to know, which of course is perfect for OSINT and for gathering information to target your intended victim. So please, be a little bit careful what you put out there, whether you're governmental or whether you're an enterprise. That is actively used, and we see them actively using this. I think some of these information operations, right? Also interesting, the disinformation, amplifying messaging, it relies a lot on some of these OSINT type of informations. Physical intrusions, very interesting cases there. This also a lot of times has a human component. So we see actual traveling of, let's say, agents into other countries. There have been known exposed operations where they either try to plant rogue devices or try to even hack into networks close to the perimeter of these actual buildings, right? There's been quite some examples of that. But all, in the end, is to support a wider cyber offensive operation. So if we look at the traditional red team scope, right? So if we look at a company like Trend or other, let's say, mainstream security companies, then it's very much about simulating cybercrime, right? Most of what we deal with in incident response is still cybercrime related, so it's a lot of ransomware actors. I would say like 20–30% of what we do is APT related, which is still quite a lot of cases. But we emulate, let's say, mostly cybercrime tooling. And if we look at the demand for red team exercises, that's very much enterprise related. And we'll go a little bit into what is the gap there between what we think should be done, whether you're an enterprise or whether you're a governmental or whether you're a military organization, and what is done right now. And that has to do with cost, it has to do with compliance, but there can definitely be changes there, right? So looking at that gap, we see very much a focus, if we see how organizations are red teamed and what their actual requirements are for us, that we see a lot of focus on, hey, let's see if we can quickly exploit a vulnerability, but it doesn't really provide any campaign-level context, right? So we have to understand that some of these APTs, they have an unlimited budget and they have vast amounts of time. There's ample examples, for instance, where we do retro scanning, so meaning that a campaign is uncovered, and then we acquire the IOCs, either by forensics or there are other reports of other researchers. And then we do a retro scan and see, hey, is this specific IOC, is this specific APT actually active in our customer set? And then we find sometimes that they might be active for months, if not longer. Meaning infiltration happens on a wide scale, and what they want is to stay undetected, siphoning off information. And this doesn't just happen to your little, not so well protected mid-sized company. These are enterprises, they are defense suppliers, they can be finance firms. It's a wide range of enterprises and governmentals that have these problems. But when you do red teaming itself, it's very much let's do a 5 or 10 or 15-day engagement. We have to check the compliance box, but it doesn't provide you with the context. And yes, I know that and we work with them too, we know that there's governmentals and military organizations that do this in a much more structured and grander way. But if you have suppliers or you work with private sectors or you have ties with them, whether that's technical or whether that's business-wise, and they forget to do this, you're the weakest link. I'll give you an example where we, for instance, saw that in a European country where there is a logistics company that is delivering ammunitions and weapons to certain areas within Europe, which were actively breached, and we saw exfiltration of information that's literally weapons deliveries, right? And we alert them and we talk to them, and during our investigation, we also asked them, have you ever done a red team exercise? Have you ever done breach and attack simulation specifically on APT-related information, right? Have you simulated this? Do you know where your gaps are? And the answer is, 2 years ago, we did one for 5 days because we needed to be compliant, right? That is sometimes what we are dealing with. We had an accounting firm in the United States of America. It is for 40 people, 50 people were working there. And they're doing accounting for ammunition. Never done any exercise at all. But these are suppliers to the defense industry, right? So they have a vast amount of information. But we still see that client buy-in is very tactical. So it's very much, okay, do the checkbox. Persistence, well, you have 5 days. That's what we pay for. That's where the budget is. But it's in no way does it simulate any kind of APT-related attack or any kind of tenacity or persistence that you really find with these state-sponsored attacks. So then you have to ask yourself, what's the reason to do it at all, right? So there needs to be I think, a stronger focus. And again, this is not just for governments. This is for enterprises as well, right? Anybody that touches on either critical infrastructure, national security, or is a supplier, are we preparing for the right conflict, right? If we fail to simulate these very advanced attacks. And we have really examples where, even if we are tasked to do let's say, simulation of 20, 30, sometimes 40 days, and there's ample budget, we do get the request that please don't start before 9 o'clock because we're not in the office yet, right? It's like, can the war please start after 9 and maybe stop in the weekend because, we're not there. That's difficult. That's very difficult to deal with because it doesn't reflect real-world operations. And it's very important that we realize that if we don't embrace these kind of things and we don't make this a priority, you will become the weakest link. They will exploit that, right? So I think it's very necessary that these exercises reflect the complexity of some of these attacks, that we integrate stronger OSINT, UMINT kind of operations, that the dwell time is much longer, right? That it isn't about getting in, it's about staying in and what kind of information can you exfiltrate or what kind of flags can you, let's say, capture or accomplish during a longer time. And we do understand that this is sometimes a budgetary issue. But maybe there can be a discussion about, hey, if you're a critical infrastructure, then should there be some type of support in terms of these types of exercises? We know that often there is support when the incident has occurred, right? So there will be either intelligence agencies or some kind of CERT or whatever that can help recover from these type of breaches. But funnily enough, for a lot of enterprises and for a lot of critical infrastructure, there is no help when it comes to actual simulations and red team. So we're focusing on, if the attack has happened and the information is exfiltrated, we're more than happy to help you, because then we can attribute it. But shouldn't we get some help before it actually happens? And yeah, I think that might need to be a wider discussion. Maybe that's a governmental discussion, I don't know. But I think it's certainly a interesting one. And then how do you conduct these exercises yourself, or how are you going to put some of these ABT simulations into it? Right? So social engineering is a big part of that. But there's often no time for it, and the context is very, low. So yes, you can try a few things, but let's not bother people too much. Physical security, there are companies who do this, by the way, and we sometimes offer this as well, but it's very rare that, especially in the enterprise world, supplier world, that they will take you on these kinds of efforts, because they require a lot of effort and they are sometimes expensive. But I would say not doing them is a far greater risk. And we see that, because if we look at large organizations, they will suffer a breach within the next 5 years, right? It's just what it is. It's not anymore whether they will get in. It's really how fast can you detect it. And can you make sure that your vital information is not exfiltrated? And by doing simulations and red teaming, you drive down that risk. And hopefully you can identify it much faster. So that emulation, that needs to change. So it's not about initial compromise, it's not about quick wins in terms of vulnerabilities. It requires a mind shift as well. It is really getting into that APT mindset, campaign mindset of a nation state, and how they achieve their objectives. So if we look at, for instance, some of these Chinese-related MSS operations, they are very low and slow, meaning they can be in a network for very, very long time. They learn a lot about your network, or about your infrastructure, and they are pivoting very fast from pretty advanced malware to a lot of living on the land, meaning that they will use the tooling set that you have in your own environment against you, which makes it increasingly harder to detect them. So they are adapting constantly also on what the security industry puts out, right? We've got all this beautiful technology, XDR, IPS, IDS, email security, you name it. But they will be adapting as well. So the C2 infrastructure gets much more advanced, exfiltration techniques get much more advanced. And again, that dwell time can sometimes be months, if not years. We had organizations being breached for years, and it's only sometimes by sheer luck that you find out if the forensics artifacts are still there, and then try to find out what have they exfiltrated in these 24 months. And that being a critical infrastructure, they got everything. And that happens everywhere. It's staggering, the amount of ABT-related attacks that we see in both in enterprise as well as in governments, also in Europe. So, it's not about can we get in. So my red teams, I think they have a score of 95%, so we always get in. That's not the issue. The issue is, can you detect them fast enough? And by going through the exercise, what can you learn from it? And how do you make it increasingly difficult for them to breach you the next time? So what is the proposition really? Right? So it needs to be realistic. It needs to be contextual. We need to learn more from APT-related information and how they conduct their attacks. We need to share more in the public domain. Luckily, I would say security researchers, by and large, whether that's public or private sector, they're friendly to each other. There is a lot of research sharing, but it can be better. And maybe we have to think about, can we come up with frameworks and compliancy that reflects nation state much more than it does cybercrime? We have, for instance, in Europe, and that's the national banks and the European Bank, they have TIBER, so that's threat intel-based ethical red teaming. These kind of frameworks, they do now apply to some of the financial institutions. It's a great framework. But maybe they should also apply to other critical infrastructure and or suppliers to defense and or some governmentals and or some military organizations. And then who's going to bear the cost for that? So the true assessment and being resilient is super important. So low and slow, stay in there, maybe stay dormant for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and then when your client least expects it, that's when you go for exfiltration. That's real world. Not starting at 9 o'clock and then, okay, we'll call you up, we're going to start the exfiltration at 2 o'clock, just look at your console, see if you detect it. That's not real world. And that campaign level thinking, and therefore I think it's also important that the public sector itself interfaces with the private sector and some of the security companies to explain it from their side. How do you think, what are these campaign objectives? What would you do? What information would you be after? And I know that sometimes that sharing is difficult between public and private infrastructure or companies, but I think there is a need for it. And I think it could be very beneficial for us as well to learn some of these things, because it gives us information about that mindset, and that will help us to ultimately defend from it. Because the large security players, like Trend, like a Palo, like a Cisco, like a CrowdStrike, they are responsible for defense or digital defense for a large part of enterprises and or governments, right? So I think that relationship is very important, and that need not only translate to detection and to services like MDR or XDR products, but it also needs to translate into offensive security. How do we conduct these enterprises with an APT level mindset in order to strengthen our organizations? And therefore understand where is that weakest link. Because everybody thinks they're not the weakest link. But I guarantee you it's out there. And that whole chain, from government to private sector, from kinetic battlefield to cyber operations, there is a weakest link there. And when you have unlimited funds and you have unlimited time, they will find it and they will exploit it. So yeah, it's super important that we learn how to identify that and that we work together in order to strengthen those defenses. That was it for me. Thank you very much.